So, Lindsay, we're here to talk about all things China, really. What's going on with Taiwan, what's going on with America's involvement, the parallels with Ukraine, possibly, and the rise of China. What are you going to tell me?
I'm going to tell you how everyone's looking at Ukraine, how the Taiwanese are afraid that the Chinese are going to pick their moment and their moment is now. And the Americans are looking at this situation and going, what the hell are we going to do?
So, Lindsay, there's been a lot going on with Taiwan, with China, with the United States recently. Nancy Pelosi might be going there, she might not. President Biden had a phone call last week with Xi Jinping. Why has there been this heightening of tensions around Taiwan this year specifically?
Yeah, so the immediate thing is the potential visit of Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, to Taiwan. There hasn't been a visit by a Speaker of the House, someone that senior, since 1997 when Newt Gingrich went. I mean, there's an echo of the past. And you have had other, visits by other Congress people and so on, and some quite recently, one by Mike Pompeo, who you may remember as being in Donald Trump's administration. But Nancy Pelosi is, I mean, from her point of view, she's 82. She's supposed to be retiring in the autumn. This is sort of her swan song, as it were. In her California constituency, there are many people of Chinese descent. She's always spoken out on human rights in China. So Taiwan is an important, it's an important issue for her.
I think that it's important for us to show support for Taiwan. I also think that none of us has ever said we're for independence when it comes to Taiwan. That's up to Taiwan to decide.
But from the Chinese point of view, she is second in line to the presidency. They've got the president, and then if he keeled over, you have the vice president. And if the vice president keeled over, then the presidency goes to the Speaker of the House. And so from the Chinese point of view, she is much too senior to be going, and they don't like that. And they say that if she does go, it will be met with strong and resolute measures.
我们已经多次表明坚决反对佩洛西众议长访台的严正立场。如果美方一意孤行，挑战中方底线，必将遭到坚决反制。
And in the Global Times, which is a newspaper of the Chinese elite foreign policy, they're talking even about the possibility of Chinese fighter jets escorting her into Taipei. Now, that might be a bit provocative.
When you try to read the sort of diplomatic lines, when China says something like that, is that them actually threatening?
Well, it's against the background, isn't it? So there's what they call grey zone tactics, and that's what we've seen in the last year, which is Chinese fighter jets and to some extent their naval craft just probing into Taiwan, not right into their airspace and so on, but very near. At the same time, the Americans are there. They're in the region at the same time. And what one of the senior American officials from the Defense Department said the other day is, the problem with all this is that sooner or later there's going to be an accident. And that's what people fear, that you've got that many warships and aircraft, around in the region, something can go wrong, something can crash. And that's when you have a real problem. And that, I think, is why the American military are very worried about Nancy Pelosi's visits. It could be seen as provocative. And Joe Biden said that the military advised him that this would not be a good time for her to do that.
I think that the military thinks it's not a good idea right now. But I don't know what the status of it is.
We know that, Beijing does want to eventually have Taiwan as part of the Chinese mainland. Do they see a weakness?
Yeah, they see American weakness, and that was definitely exacerbated by the retreat from Kabul, Afghanistan, in last August. They watched that. And also Xi Jinping, I mean, he's much more belligerent about Taiwan than his predecessors have been. And he calls himself a man of history. He is somebody who, I think that, you can see him wanting the reunification of China as they see it, because they regard Taiwan as a renegade province. He wants that to be in his legacy. He talks about great changes unseen in a century. So I think that what you see there is not necessarily that they're going to invade this week, next week. I don't think we're talking about that, but you see an intention and you see a sense that that this is now within their sights.
And is there a sense as well that even before the war in Ukraine, which has perhaps shifted American focus towards Europe, that actually America hadn't really given sufficient attention over the years to Taiwan and to that region?
Well, I think that changed under Donald Trump because, we go back to 1979, which is when the Americans recognized China, communist China, the People's Republic of China, as China, they gave the diplomatic recognition, whereas before it had been with Taiwan, which is called the Republic of China, ROC. Um, and so, but part of that deal was always that, or was it what they call strategic ambiguity.
Hmm.
And what that means is that America said, okay, there's one China. It's ruled from Beijing. And we're going to recognize that diplomatically. But we will always support Taiwan economically, people to people contacts, and so on, but also provide weapons for self defense. Not if China were to invade Taiwan, we, the Americans, would go in and defend them, but we will provide them with what they need to defend themselves. The question now is whether there should be strategic clarity. The Americans saying, you do that, we're going to defend Taiwan.
Because Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, he said in an interview with The Atlantic, when it comes to Taiwan generally, every administration's Taiwan policy, both its declaratory policy and its actual policy, have contained multitudes, many different senses that you look at collectively and say, how do these all fit together? The sort of sense that strategic ambiguity has essentially muddled them through the last 40 years. But maybe we now live in a time where, with a more belligerent China, you can't really have any ambiguity anymore.
Well, certainly that's what the Trump administration, what many Republicans would say, that you have to have strategic clarity. We will defend Taiwan. It's a democracy. But many scholars who work on China and Taiwan say, actually, strategic ambiguity is quite a good thing. You want to keep the Chinese guessing. And also, you don't want to provoke the Chinese. And if you say, we will defend Taiwan, then the Chinese might say, right, maybe it's time to go for it. And so I think a lot of people look at this situation with a great deal of concern and say, actually, ambiguity is not such a bad thing. Ambiguity has kept the peace, and maybe we should continue with that.
And in terms of that sort of ambiguity, it obviously goes back to the history in terms of back in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists were defeated by Mao Zedong's communists. Chiang Kai-shek retreats to Taiwan. That's why you then have, as you say, the Republic of China and Taiwan, the People's Republic, over on the mainland. Is there a sense, though, that when it comes to Taiwan specifically, and I want to get into sort of comparisons to Ukraine, Taiwan itself has always sort of said, we don't want independence. The Kuomintang, which was Chiang Kai-shek's party, were always like, we don't want independence, but we want to stay apart from China. But in recent decades, there has been a more democratic people's movement who do want independence. So there is a bit of a change.
Yeah, there's definitely a change. Thanks for doing the potted history, by the way, so that I didn't have to do it. I thought that was very succinct. Yeah, look, Tsai Ing-wen, who's the president of Taiwan, she's part of that party that does favor independence, but at the same time, they know that would be seen by China as a provocation. And look, most people in Taiwan live their lives as if they are an independent country. There are many people around the world who don't realize that Taiwan isn't an independent country. But that threat is always there. And I think that what we've seen in recent years is that as many more people in Taiwan move towards wanting independence, thinking, well, this is how we live anyway, and we're a prosperous state, why shouldn't? And we're a democratic state. We definitely don't want to come under the Communist Party. As they have moved more in that direction, the Chinese have become more determined.
And how much are the Taiwanese people and the Taiwanese government looking at Ukraine as a possible sign of the future?
I think everyone's looking at Ukraine and because the sort of unthinkable has happened, which is that, an incredibly powerful, well-armed country has invaded a much weaker and smaller country. So President Tsai Ing-wen, what did she say? She said Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine has shown us that autocratic regimes will not hesitate to violate the sovereignty of other states.
Mhm.
So, in other words, she sees it as really worrying for Taiwan. But then you look at what happened in Ukraine. Well, the Russians didn't get it all their own way at the beginning, did they? So, what the Taiwanese might learn from that is, well, if we are determined enough and our morale is high enough, David and Goliath. Sometimes, well, not necessarily that David wins, but David can hold Goliath off until the West comes in with more weaponry and more help and so on. So I think that is the lesson that Taiwan is taking from Ukraine. But then what lesson is China taking from Ukraine? And this is kind of really interesting because we know that the Chinese always study in great depth what's going on. And I think that although they have sided with Moscow, there's a very important, connection between China and Russia, which see America, are united in a sense against the Americans. I think that they're also quite worried about it. And, the American and Western sanctions on Russia, it's really interesting to note that the Chinese have abided by those sanctions. They've not been investing in Russia because their companies are worried about being sanctioned. And so that indicates that they're not actually necessarily pleased about this. And I think that they also look at Russia's failure to immediately overwhelm Ukraine.
Which follows on from what the CIA director said, which is that what they think China seems to be learning from Ukraine when it comes to Taiwan is the idea that you need to have that, as you say, quick, decisive victory. And he said, Bill Burns, I suspect the lesson the Chinese leadership and military are drawing is that you've got to amass overwhelming force.
I wouldn't underestimate, President Xi's determination to assert China's control, the People's Republic of China's control over Taiwan.
So isn't that the worry here is that that's what they'll end up doing?
Yeah, look, there is that possibility. And certainly the Chinese military is modernizing, and the Americans are very worried because China is far ahead when it comes to artificial intelligence and cyber and all of these sort of parts of modern warfare. I mean, it's not like, the Russians, it's like World War I there in Ukraine sometimes with the artillery. It's so crude. But with China, we're talking, and with Taiwan, these are very technologically advanced economies. And certainly the Chinese are pushing ahead there, and the Russian and the Americans are, fighting, running to catch up. So in that sense, the argument could be that maybe the Chinese would rather go sooner because they're leading the way on this. But they don't have the overwhelming force yet. And I think that also, there's another way of looking at it. We're all talking about, as you said, blitzkrieg. Well, there are other ways of weakening Taiwan. What about taking a couple of the small islands? Would the Americans respond to that, or are they just a couple of small islands? What about a blockade? If you had a blockade of Taiwan, so what are the American, frigates and carriers going to do then? That puts it much more on the Americans. Oh, the Americans are starting the war. All we're doing is, for reasons of self-defense, we're doing this small blockade. So that's you who's starting the war, not us. There's all sorts of different ways that the Chinese can put pressure, which are short of a full-scale invasion.
If we talk about David and Goliath and the way that Ukraine has managed to successfully, at least, not become completely overwhelmed by the Russians, with the Taiwanese, are they better prepared? Have they got a better system available there? Is someone like Washington looking at this going, this is now the time to start ramping up supplies towards Taiwan in the way that they've sort of been left behind a bit in Ukraine? Is that now happening?
Yeah, I think that the Americans are providing more weaponry and they provide training and so on, and they do it pretty quietly because they don't want it to be seen as provocative. But I think that the other aspect, which I think is very important, is when you look at Ukraine, the first place to fall was Kherson and that area in the south near Crimea. And it's now coming out that the reason for that is because the military and to some extent the civilian administration there was penetrated by the Russians. There were spies and there were traitors. And so then the next question, and I can pose the question and I have no idea what the answer is, which is to what extent is the Taiwanese military penetrated by Chinese spies? I have no idea. But that would be, incredibly important. And we're not just talking about individual spies, we're also talking about cyber. We're talking about what you know from space and so on. And so all of this is going on and hardening the Taiwanese systems of defense against that. And also, I presume, the Americans trying to penetrate the Chinese digitally and so on. So all of this stuff is going on all sides.
Moving slightly away from Taiwan and talking about China in general, it does feel that there has been a shift, perhaps since Donald Trump, I don't know, in understanding China as a much bigger threat. It feels like we've moved on from David Cameron sipping a pint with Xi Jinping in a pub in 2015, I believe it was. Does it feel that way, that there is this shift in geopolitics towards realizing that China in several years will become the great power, will become the biggest economy?
Yeah, it's a huge shift. And Xi Jinping is the leader who wants to ensure that that shift happens on his watch. And so since Mao Zedong died, the Chinese Communist Party had a system whereby leaders only lasted for 10 years, 2 5-year terms. And we're coming up in November to the 20th Party Congress. Xi Jinping has had his 2 5-year terms, and he plans to stay on for a third, maybe a fourth, maybe a fifth. He may get called chairman, like we had Chairman Mao. So this is a very different leader. This is a leader who has consolidated power around him within the party and clearly plans to be, as we said before, this man of history. And Taiwan is the legacy that I think he wants to have. Now, that the fact that he plans to stay in power for so long means that he doesn't have to do it before November. He might have 5, 10, 15, 20 years to do it in. Who knows how long he will last. But that shift is there. But at the same time, on the negative side, from the Chinese point of view, their economy is beginning to falter in a way that it didn't before. So this inexorable rise economically, we're now in a different stage. And actually, Xi Jinping's policies have not been great. So, COVID, zero COVID policy, this isn't working. This is one of the reasons that the whole world economy is slowing down, because they haven't developed an mRNA vaccine that is very effective, and they won't import. And so that means that their vaccination rate's not very high, and they're insisting on these total lockdowns. So Shanghai was under lockdown, I don't know, for weeks and weeks, just a short while ago. And people started to protest. People were hungry. They weren't allowed to go out and buy food. Xi Jinping is much more sort of Marxist-Leninist than his predecessors, and sort of centrally planned economy and so on. He's quite suspicious of the private sector. And you have at the moment, a massive property company called Evergrande, which is, basically it's bust. It has no liquidity, it has no money. And this is really putting stress on the banking system. And so you had in some smaller towns, not very long ago, just a few weeks ago, you had big protests because people couldn't get their money out of the bank. Their cash was frozen. And so you have quite a sort of pent-up anger. You have obviously great repression, and we've seen that in Xinjiang.
And how does the West play this?
Well, look, there are different views on this, and obviously you have people like the Republicans, Donald Trump, who will just say should all be confrontation. And then you would have people like John Kerry, who's Joe Biden's climate envoy, saying, well, hang on, we need to talk to the Chinese about climate and climate change, because we can't really make much progress unless they're also making progress. And instead, the Chinese are making progress. They produce more wind turbines and solar panels than anywhere else on Earth, even though they still have their coal-fired power stations. So that would be an area where you could have cooperation. And I think that certainly Joe Biden, who I think has spoken to Xi Jinping 5 times now, including last week's conversation,
But never in person.
No, on the phone.
Yeah.
He would see that you have a sort of give and take. That you have to cooperate in some areas, and you try and expand that area of cooperation, but you don't. But that doesn't mean you take your eye off the ball when it comes to Taiwan, and it doesn't mean you withdraw your fleets from the South China Sea and the Pacific and so on. And certainly, Kevin Rudd again would say, what you don't do is lots of jumping up and down and screaming and shouting and talking about how terrible China is publicly and denouncing them and so on, which we see a lot of amongst politicians in Australia, America, and to some extent here in the UK as well. So you don't do that. You try and have conversations. But at the same time, you do, make sure that your military posture is ready. And so that's why we've had, this new alliance between Australia, the UK, and the US, which is all about countering China in the South China Sea and the Pacific, and why you try and shore up your relationships with other countries in Asia, obviously Japan, South Korea, and so on.
But isn't if a lesson from Ukraine is that Ukraine, not a member of NATO, not a member of the EU, there's no official defense policy there. There is no official, I guess, in writing defense policy for America, is there? For
No,
Taiwan.
but there is the official promise to help them defend themselves, which arguably is what is happening in Ukraine. And one of the interesting things I think about Joe Biden is that he's very keen on this idea of supporting other democracies and they're sort of having some kind of union of democracies, because he sees all the problems which you have with the UN and so on, and with the rise of autocratic states. And so I mean, again, it is Ukraine is very interesting because it's the question of how far will Western countries led by America go in defending Ukraine against Russia, and obviously that is still playing out, and that's another thing that the Taiwanese will be looking at. How far would they go to defend us? I think we know that they would go some way.
The Thucydides trap, if you know about it.
I know about the Thucydides trap.
Do you want to explain it, or shall I? No, you explain it.
Basically, the idea is that if you have a declining power, then it is almost inevitable that a rising power will clash with it and there will be war. And so the Peloponnesian War, that was the decline of Sparta and the rise of Athens. And so what you have at the moment is you have the decline of America. I mean, the Americans may say they're not declining, but I think that if we look at it historically, we can see, there's a relative decline in American economic power as China rises, and similarly in military power. And we also see a weakness in America because of the disaster of their military interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, depends how far you want to go back. You go back to Vietnam as well. And so the idea of Thucydides' trap is that war in these circumstances is inevitable. Now, not every, some people would say, well, hang on, what somebody said in the 5th century BC isn't necessarily true.
But the political scientist, Graham Allison, talks about this. And he said in the last 500 years, when you've had this Thucydides trap, 16 cases, he's clocked it, where you've had a rising power and a declining power. In 16 of those cases, in the last 500 years, 12 ended up in war. So, I mean, this is the great guessing game is, does this China-America relationship, does it result in war?
No, look, and war often happens, with a sort of, a concatenation of circumstance, which is why the American military is so worried, that there could be planes crashing or something like that, which, then sparks a war. You never know, somebody could walk across a bridge and kill an archduke, and then, where are you then? So all of that's a great danger when you have tension at the height it is now. But other people, and again, back to Kevin Rudd, he would say that war is not inevitable, but you have to prepare for it, and you have to keep those diplomatic channels open. And of course, that's very difficult for, human rights type people as well, keeping diplomatic channels open with China when they're locking up millions of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and they're basically trying to wipe out a culture. And also what they did in Tibet. I mean, this is very, very hard stuff. And yet, if you don't keep some kind of diplomatic channel open and cooperate on some fronts, that makes war more likely, because when you do have some kind of accident, you need that hotline. You need a way to be able to talk to them. And certainly, I think that that's what President Biden believes, unlike President Trump. He believes that you have to keep the lines open. But of course, the danger for Taiwan is that they're just going to get crushed in the tectonic plates of history.
Lindsey Hilsum, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.